Hello and welcome to We Can Do Better, a podcast about ending poverty in our time. My name is Fran. I'm a law professor. I go with my students every week to eviction court. When we're in court, we represent some of the millions of people in this country who are facing the loss of their homes. These same people are oftentimes not filling prescriptions. They're oftentimes even going hungry, despite the fact that we and they are living in the richest nation in the world. We can do better. So this week, we're going to talk about a new piece of legislation. It's called the 21st Century Road to Housing Act. The Road to Housing Act passed Congress and went into law earlier this month in July. And we're going to talk about what that law does and what it maybe doesn't do and whether it moves the needle for the housing crisis that we're seeing in our eviction court and that all of us see in our communities with people who are living on the streets, people are doubled up, people who are having to live in cars. So for this conversation, we welcome in our show's producer to in front of the camera instead of behind the camera. Jack Quigley is a journalist, and he's now the Chief Marketing Officer for 14 regional construction trade magazines. And Jack and I are going to talk about the new law today. So, Jack, thank you for doing this, and welcome back to being on air and not just behind the scenes.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I will hand over questioning about the 21st Century Road to Housing Act to you. I'll be your guest.
All right. Well, could you explain a little bit about what the law actually changes and I guess what kind of led up to this passing?
So the New York Times had a description of this law called a hodgepodge, and I think that's a fair description, and partly because of what you said. It's been a minute since we've had any housing legislation, so there's been a lot of kind of pent up issues. And so I'll give a quick rundown of those topics that are covered in the legislation. But the spoiler alert is that there is a lot that doesn't cover and a lot that really is critically important to the housing crisis that we're seeing in our communities that is not touched by this legislation. But overall, the theme of it is that it focuses on increasing the supply of market rate housing, which is not a bad thing. But as we'll see, it doesn't necessarily touch the challenges that we're seeing in eviction court and that we all see in our communities. But to answer your question of what led up to this, the idea of having more market rate housing, of building more housing, is a fairly bipartisan idea. And of course, we're living in a world right now, or a country right now, with a Republican-controlled Congress and a Republican-controlled presidential administration. So nothing would ever have passed without it being a bipartisan idea that it's good to build more housing, market rate housing. So that's one of the things that the legislation does is address something, and I do think this has value, is the United States is almost uniquely dominated by a model of single-family housing, separate single-family housing. And this legislation, especially if it's accompanied by more state and local laws that impact zoning, which is really going to be critical, is it would set the stage for gradually making the single-family home neighborhoods a little bit more dense, a little bit taller, a little more multi-generational, all of which would create more market rate housing, and that's a good thing. The legislation also allows cities to use this form of federal funds called the Community Development Block Grant Funds to use more of it for housing construction. Again, building more housing, that's a good thing. It would make it a little bit, or it sets the stage really for making it easier for more manufactured housing, factory-made housing. Sometimes those of us, particularly from my generation, will call this the mobile homes, right? As a trailer home park. But in reality, much of that type of housing is not built to be moved at all. And essentially, it is factory-made housing, which can be quite a bit cheaper and therefore more accessible, especially to home ownership for people with relatively low incomes and oftentimes renting. In many communities, that is a really important source of low-income housing. So making it easier for there to be mass-produced factory-made housing and loosening some of the regulations that are outdated, that's also a good thing. There's some part of the legislation talks about getting disaster recovery funds to make it a little bit easier to help people who need housing help. That's a good thing. And I think the most impactful maybe for the low-income people that we see who are facing eviction, people who are homeless, is going to be some changes to their potential changes to the housing choice voucher program. The voucher program is when folks get subsidized housing, and instead of a unit in a public housing facility, they will actually get a voucher and they can use that voucher and go out and find a private landlord to accept it. And therefore, the subsidy will go from the federal government, usually through a state government or local government, to the private landlord themselves. It's been hard for private landlords to get approved for this program, to have their housing inspected. So there's some tweaks to that process that should make it a little bit easier for private landlords to do that. So those are all positive things. There's a little bit of concern there because it seems to set the stage, this legislation seems to set the stage for more of the HUD focus on work requirements for folks who are getting subsidized housing. And we'll talk about that in a subsequent episode. We've talked about work requirements for SNAP benefits and the danger they can cause a little bit already. So, but overall, not bad. And overall can help a little bit, definitely in the overall picture of folks who are moderate income and struggling to find a place to live.
So can I ask a simple question that may seem obvious? So obviously, if there's a housing shortage, increasing supply seems to be like that would be a easy fix. I don't know about easy, but a fix. What about the wages for people that are actually affording these places? I mean, is building 100,000 new units at the same price going to make a difference if people can't afford that?
Yeah, it will make a difference to a point. And you're right to say that building all this housing. So what it will do is it will have the effect of more supply in the market, should lower the cost a little bit for market rate housing that is provided by for-profit landlords, if we're talking about renting. And that's good. But the reality is it can only go so far. And that, for instance, the average rental price in our hometown of Indianapolis, which is relatively cheap compared to other metropolitan areas, is about $1,200 a month for a one bedroom. And maybe a for-profit landlord, if there's a lot of supply out there and they've got to compete a little bit more, they could lower that price to, maybe they lower it a couple $100 a month, but they can't lower it all the way down to the level that's affordable for the very poor people, because then they can't pay their own expenses. So market rate housing is good for a substantial percentage of the population. But for the folks we see in eviction court, the folks we see who are on the streets, people who are sleeping in their cars, et cetera, they're in need of subsidized housing. And so we have some fixes that we should make to that we can talk about. But there's one of the real deans of housing policy in the United States is a guy named Alan Malik, and he wrote an article back in 2019, and I think his title said it exactly right. Rents will only go so low no matter how much we build, because for-profit landlords are not going to be able to provide housing at just a few $100s a month. And when we have folks, which we talked about it in last week's episode with Stephen Nunez of the Roosevelt Institute, there's millions of people in this country who are living with disabilities, and their entire monthly income is $1,000 a month. For them, the recommended amount that we all should be paying for housing is like 30% of our income. So the recommended amount they should be paying is $300. There's no for-profit landlord in the country who is going to rent out a home or a unit for $300. They can't afford to do that. So for-profit landlords can't be the real answer for these very poor people. And it's not just people on SSI, it's seniors living with fixed incomes. It's a lot of folks we see who are single parents with kids and they're making low wages. As to your point, if they're making $13 an hour and they're struggling to get 35 hours a week at scattered times, that is just not enough to afford market rate housing consistently. And when something happens and a crisis happens in their family, and that's who we see in eviction court, because they've been paying way more than they should be paying on housing because they're paying market rate housing. So we could talk a little bit about the answers, what real housing legislation that would fix that would look like. And the 21st Century Road to Housing Act doesn't do that. And if I could say one thing about it is I don't want to be critical. I'm just great appreciation for the people who push for this legislation. The National Low Income Housing Coalition, I think we'll put a link to their explainer about the legislation in much more detail than I gave in the show notes. And they have worked really hard. It's a tough environment to lobby at any time for poor people, because poor people don't have the power in these legislative bodies, definitely in a Republican-controlled Congress. So great shout out to them. Legislation is the art of the possible, but it seems worthwhile to point out this is not going to fix everything by any means. And it's really not touching the real crisis that we see. Which leads me to a question for you. Can I ask you a question? Even though
Yes.
you're supposed to be the one now. So this is a question from your boomer father to my Gen Z son. You are Gen Z, right?
I am. Yeah. Sorry,
Okay.
my cat food thing just went off. Maybe that's a Gen Z thing.
Okay. I don't know. Shout out to Skeeter for making his appearance on the podcast. So I want to say, and this is maybe it's going to just behind the curtain of how we're going to title the podcast so people can see how the inner workings of this award-winning podcast. I don't want to say it's a nothing burger piece of legislation. It's not a nothing burger piece of legislation. I was thinking like it's kind of weak sauce. I actually said to somebody that maybe it should be like a golf clap and they didn't know what I was talking about. So that's probably not the right. Is it meh? Is it mid? I don't know what you say when something is just like not great, but not much.
I think mid is probably the way to go. Definitely not weak sauce. I don't think that's ever been.
Have you even heard the term weak sauce before?
I don't know if I have heard.
Okay. Mid. So that's we're going to go with the 21st Century Road to Housing Act is mid.
Yes. I think that's
okay. We may not make our friends at the National Low Income Housing Coalition happy, but I think that actually the National Housing Law Project, which is a companion organization, does good work. If I can, I want to read their statement about the act because I think they said it very nicely.
I was going to ask you to the silver bullet.
Yeah, okay. Well, what they said is, quote, "This is progress, but it is no silver bullet. We call on Congress to go further in addressing the housing crisis for poor and working people by making significant financial investments to build new housing, including new public housing, and to pass legislation that will protect and empower tenants." So that's a nicer way of saying progress, but no silver bullet. That, again, these are folks who have to operate in a really challenging environment. But from what we see in eviction court, it's not going to make any difference at all, as far as I can tell. And when we see people who are unhoused on the street, people who are sleeping in their car, I just don't think it's going to make any difference at all. If you are low to middle income, maybe, and you're maybe the overall average rent price will go down a little bit, but and maybe if you're trying to get access to purchasing a home, which a great more power to you. This might help a little bit, but it's not fixing the crisis for those who are unhoused or on the path to being unhoused.
So is there like a logical next step for this?
Yeah, there is, and it's been proposed. These have been proposed and discussed, and as we always mention that the folks we see in eviction court, the folks we see on the streets, they are losers in this cruel musical chairs game because they are eligible for federally subsidized housing, which would be that game changer. We talked about that they would be paying 30% of their income for rent and the federal government would be subsidizing the rest. So if someone's living on a disability income of $1,000 a month, they only will pay $300. Now their rent's probably going to be $1,100, but the federal government and the subsidy will pay the rest. The problem is those subsidized programs, whether they're vouchers or public housing or what have you, are not entitlements. So we talk about this cruel musical chairs game because for every four households who are eligible for this subsidy, only one of them get it and three of them lose. So it's just incredibly, that would be a really crappy children's game, right? If you have a musical chairs game where 3 out of every 4 lose, but that's what we do with housing. And almost every single person we've ever represented over the years in eviction court is eligible for subsidized housing. Every single person you see on the street or sleeping in a car, et cetera, they are eligible for subsidized housing. They just don't get it. They may be on a wait list. The wait list itself may be closed, et cetera, because the need is so much higher. So we don't treat it as an entitlement. We treat Medicaid, we treat food stamps as an entitlement. If you're eligible for it, you receive it. And so if we did that with housing, frankly, the eviction courts would empty out. Our shelters would empty out. We wouldn't see folks who don't have housing. And it's not such a crazy thing to propose. It's been proposed in legislation before. Sometimes it's proposed in terms of universal housing vouchers, because that's the easiest way, because there is private rental housing out there, just giving folks the vouchers to be able to go out and secure it. There's logistical challenges to that, which we can address in another episode probably. But that's done in other nations that aren't even as wealthy as ours, where they just treat housing as an entitlement. If you're eligible for it, you're poor, you can't afford market rate housing, you get this subsidy, you get this benefit. So universal housing vouchers will be the short term. We could do that almost right away because there is the private rental market out there that can be subsidized to house poor people. The longer term, bigger picture answer in my view and a lot of folks' view is just more and better public housing. And that's a little bit ironic for folks talking from the perspective of our law school clinic, because we have sued our public housing agency multiple times. Our public housing agency has done a very poor job of providing safe and secure housing. One of the worst in the nation, but it's not the only one. And other public housing agencies have struggled, but they've struggled mostly because we've underfunded them and we haven't provided enough money for maintenance, enough money for security, et cetera. And if we provide that support for the existing public housing, and one of the ways to do it is a piece of legislation called the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act. And Senator Bernie Sanders, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, and others have proposed this for several years now, which would essentially put the kind of money that we need to put into fixing and maintaining our current public housing stock. But it would also, and other pieces of legislation would do that as well, start again building high quality, attractive, well-located, safe public housing. And again, we used to do that in the United States, and other nations still do it all the time. So if we had universal housing vouchers, if we had more and better public housing, if we had rental assistance programs, all of those would make a real dent in the crisis that we see. And the 21st Century Road to Housing Act doesn't touch any of that. And again, I do think that circles back to the political realities that kind of legislation was not getting through this particular Congress. So this is the best you could hope for in this particular Congress. But I think and I'm glad we're talking about it, because I think there's value in not letting the PR suggest that the problem's really being addressed, because it's not.
Yeah, definitely. I have a question that's maybe a little, it's on topic, but you mentioned that we used to build affordable housing in this country a lot. And honestly, it feels like every affordable housing building you see, it's from like the 70s or earlier. Why did we stop doing that? Is it a money? Because it feels to me like there's more people on the streets and there's less people trying to fix that. I don't know. Maybe that's just a sad thing.
No, that's the reality. And just this week in our hometown of Indianapolis, the data came back that our homeless numbers actually increased despite many efforts to change that. And not a surprise, our eviction numbers are crazy high. 500 evictions filed each week just in our community alone in Indianapolis, and so tens of thousands a year. So the reason that we don't see much of a truly affordable housing is partly because the truly affordable housing being built would be public housing. And there is something called the Faircloth Amendment that dates back to the late 1990s, which makes it illegal to build more public housing. That you can build some public housing to replace housing that's been demolished, but essentially the Faircloth Amendment really limits new public housing development. And so you don't see, as you say, you don't see new high quality public housing being built in the United States. So why was that passed? It was passed partly because public housing has such a well-deserved bad reputation, but that well-deserved bad reputation is because it's been starved of resources for decade after decade after decade, and they were poorly designed, poorly maintained. But why did that happen? Why were they starved of resources? Well, you have to recognize that public housing to some extent competes with the real estate industry, competes with for-profit housing. And then from the very beginning of public housing in the early mid 20th century, the real estate industry, which is very powerful politically, very powerful lobbyists, very powerful campaign contributors, have made sure that public housing is not an attractive option, and that people don't want to be there because they want people to want to leave public housing, which they do, and run out and pay for-profit market rate housing rents, which they do. And we see that with our clients in public housing all the time. They cannot wait for the most part to get out of there. And sometimes they're going to be happy to get out of there and pay 80% of their income just to be in better quality housing. So that's part of the answer. The real quote unquote affordable housing construction that's been done the last few decades is through the LIHTC program, the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which is probably worth an episode in itself. But the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, I would suggest, is very poorly named because it is not very conducive to low income people living there unless they have vouchers on top of the low-income housing tax credit subsidy. So the low-income housing tax credit just essentially lowers the rent just a bit, but it is still very close to and sometimes almost at market rate, even though it's supposedly quote-unquote affordable housing. So that's not anywhere near the kind of deep subsidy, the deeply affordable housing that public housing or housing choice voucher would provide. So again, that's why it would be fastest to just have universal vouchers available so people could go out in the private market. But that has a challenge, and you have to have landlords that will accept it, and it then further enriching for-profit landlords. So the big picture, long-term answer is more and better public housing. So the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act and some other legislation has been proposed. Obviously, Senator Sanders and Representative Ocasio-Cortez and others like them are not passing legislation through this particular Congress and not getting it approved by this particular presidential administration. So it will have to wait for another Congress and another administration, which we hopefully will have. Prayers up. Yes.
Well, yeah, I feel like walking around lately, there's been more people on the streets. I mean, obviously there's no scientific way for me to say that. I don't know. It just feels like not a whole lot is improving, but it's good to hear that at least something has started the path to improvement. I don't know that we're calling it mid, but it's still a step in the right direction, I guess, right?
Yeah. And I think I think maybe that's exactly what the National Housing Law Project or something like that. So that I sometimes get a little discouraged and would say it's not much of a step because it's not really addressing, but the needs of the lowest income people who we do see unhoused or we do see being evicted. But it shows that there's widespread concern, right? And there's nothing, that's a good thing. It shows that the community and lawmakers and the media and the general public do think there's a problem. And hopefully after a year or two and maybe some different dynamics in the Congress, et cetera, once we see that this legislation has not fixed it and isn't going to be the fix, then we can have the real discussion about how we make sure there's much more and better subsidized housing, because that is the answer.
Well, is there anything I haven't asked you?
I don't think so. Is there anything that, now that we know the title of this is going to have the word mid in it, that's
like
my biggest
mid
21st
century.
Ooh, yeah.
There's something there.
Mid 21st. Yeah, there is something there. So again, shout out to the people who worked hard to get this legislation passed. Good on, can't hurt anything, but we need a lot more. Okay, well, thank you for hosting this week, and look forward to you doing that again sometime soon with me or a much more qualified guest. So want to tell people who are our loyal listeners that we have episodes coming up on universal childcare. We're going to talk with folks from New Mexico that actually has universal childcare throughout the state about how they won that, how incredibly popular and effective that has been. We're going to talk to a tax law professor, which doesn't sound like it's super exciting, but it is exciting because she has written a book about how to make sure that the tax code actually causes rich people to pay their taxes, which they do not now, as she's going to outline. And then if we're going to tax the rich, here's how we do it. And then if we do tax the rich, guess what? We're going to have enough money for subsidized housing for everybody. We're going to have money for healthcare. We're going to have enough money for childcare for all. So that's super, super critical. So looking forward to those conversations in the future. And until that time, thank you for listening. And remember, we can do better.